Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the South Asian History Month. I'm Dr. Subodh Dave, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on current and future challenges. South Asian history is inextricably linked with British history. My grandfather, a railwayman, used to speak admiringly of top British quality, which was his way of indicating a stamp of approval for British-made goods, including, of course, the railways, which he was very proud of, and which is a mark of the British presence in South Asia. And even today, parts of Kolkata and Colombo, you'll find them, they're more British than Britain could ever be. But colonialism does leave a legacy on the psyche, and that continues for generations. My grandmother, she didn't speak English, but she used the phrase inferiority complex. And even as a child, way before I knew I was going to become a psychiatrist, I was familiar with this phrase, inferiority complex, that she used to describe the relationship between the average Indian and the colonial masters. And so you can see how a phrase like that can have a lasting legacy for generations. And here we are today in 2020, and then what does this South Asian history, and a lot of it is a shared history, mean for Britain, for British South Asians, indeed British psychiatrists of South Asian origin, and for psychiatry as a whole, and more specifically for British psychiatrists. So I hope that we get to hear some of those answers today. We've kind of had our first seminar, and we've learned to talk about culture in our multicultural society in a way of, we celebrate our beers with tikka masala, we celebrate conversations around culture, but often discussions around culture and race and ethnicity have a way of figuring only when there are clashes. And this particular History Month comes at a time when we've had several colleagues of South Asian origin lose their life to COVID, unfortunately. This particular month comes when many BAME and non-BAME colleagues have taken to the knee, frustrated with the slow progress on the race equality agenda in wider society. And for us in psychiatry, there is a direct relevance to the outcomes for our patients. We all know about the difficulties that certain populations have in accessing care, the higher detention rates for some of BAME patients, the poor career progression for BAME colleagues, the poor chances of ending up in leadership positions, the poorer educational attainment in exams, and I could go on. So there are quite a few challenges, and I'm sure that our rich galaxy of panelists today will cover some of these challenges and will enlighten us. And it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Professor Cam Bhui, who probably needs very little introduction. He's a very well-known figure in the sphere of race and culture, having been a professor at the Queen Mary University, and has recently moved to Oxford. He's also, of course, the editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Psychiatrists and a very accomplished academician. And I look forward to hearing from you, Cam, about your views on structural racism in the UK. Welcome, Cam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to contribute, and congratulations to the college officers and Paul Rees and all of the speakers and the membership of the college for being so progressive and setting up something like this. It's a great honor. So I want to talk a little bit about my identity, I suppose, as a cultural psychiatrist and as a South Asian. That's quite challenging because there's lots of complexity. Fortunately, I've been part of a series of seminars with the World Association of Cultural Psychiatry and Transcultural Psychiatry Special Interest Group, as well as the WPA Transcultural Group, where we present cultural biographies to each other as a way of understanding culture and complexity, and also as a way of recognizing different forms of scholarship and challenges that we face and understanding different geopolitical conditions. And also, interestingly, of a way of escaping from those imprecise identities that are projected upon us and we have to cope with. and we have to accommodate all the time. And so it's been a very useful experience, and I hope I can share something of the experience with you today. First of all, I have a complex identity. When Paul first asked me to do this, I said, well, I'm not purely South Asian. It's quite complicated, Paul. I have a Punjabi Sikh heritage. My father was born in India, my mother in Kenya, and I was born in Kenya, in Nakuru. So I came to the UK when I was quite young. And that meant that we had a very complex home life of images which were both South Asian and African. I didn't know that the Punjabi we spoke at home was mixed up with Swahili until I went back to India and was put right on a couple of occasions. So my experience of South Asia was really trips to Southall, to Liberty Cinema, to eat food, Indian food. You had to go to Southall in those days to get some genuine Indian food. Alternated with living in a country town, a market town in rural Buckinghamshire, where going to Saturday morning pictures meant you had to salute the Queen to the national anthem. And there's this constant betwixt and between going on. And it's perhaps why I'm so interested in acculturation. I've written a chapter for a book by, with Doreen Joseph, a service user, for a book by Georgie Cossa and Nick Boras, looking at the history of British psychiatry in Britain at the time and looking at structural violence and structural racism. And some of the examples I've used are historical events at the time. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. A year before the first man landed on the moon, and the same year as Robert Kennedy was shot. I remember a lot of the films on television, the sitcoms that were so racist when you look back at them. At the time, they were accepted. The way they were expressed as this was a way of ridiculing racism when Love Thy Neighbour was on, and both the black and the white man were being abusive to each other. Ain't I Hot Mum, for example, also conveyed a lot of stereotypes, browned up faces, for example. The Carry On movies, Mind Your Language, do you remember that? Learning a different language and immigrants combining to laugh at themselves. So these were all meant to empower, but also ridiculed and establish in British society an acceptance of racism, as well as an exposure of racism. And you may or may not agree with that, but I think there's a double-edged sword there to tackle. And there were some more extreme examples of Spike Milligan's Paki Paddy and Pakistani Daleks, and no one really thinking anything of it at the time, although that was ended in due course. We now have a new generation of films, fantastic films made by people of colour. I particularly like examples like Bend It Like Beckham and East is East, which really challenge some of the stereotypes and express some of the acculturation strains that we face without vilifying anyone, showing how difficult it is to adapt and cope with discrimination and acculturation. We also have comedians like Mira Sayal and Paul Chowdhury pouring scorn really on tribalism and cultural identities and stereotypes of cultural identity. And these are powerful tools of emancipation and empowerment. Even when you talk about beer, you have to talk about IPA and the East Indian Company, how it colonized India and made a massive global market in beer based on exporting low-calorie IPA low alcohol IPA rather, to Indian soldiers as a way of avoiding them getting overly drunk and dying in their droves because they were using large amounts of the local brew too often. So all of those challenges, I think we all probably identify with, and we all had different sorts of experience of structural violence, and it's the norm. It's not uncommon, it's not rare, and it always surprises me when people say they've never seen racism. But it was accepted that we have to deal with it positively, progressively, to overcome these challenges. I've been very fortunate in having a very powerful friendship group and strong family members, although my father was always very clear, bless him, that I would have to work twice as hard and struggle and all the rest of it. So it's important to celebrate our achievements, but also important to recognise the opportunities that we've all taken full advantage of. I've had some very good mentors and friends. I enjoyed my training at Guy's and the Maudsley. I did an psychoanalytic training, which was immensely powerful also in terms of understanding identity and looking after myself. But of course, this isn't just an academic interest of mine. We all have friends and family who suffer with violence and racism and have mental health problems. I have family members who attempted suicide and people with multiple comorbidities, for example. But look at the college, look at the South Asians in the college, what contributions they make. They are really engaged with the college. They are very active, good, loyal citizens. They're very much a we self identity, not an I self, which Dinesh has written about is great, but it can be a problem for people who live in a we self society when they get exploited by I self groups. But it's very important, and I think an essential explanation for why South Asians are doing so well and why they're so engaged with the college and so loyal and collegial in their activities. We've learned to accept the difficulties and pains and not be alienated. We've learned to tackle the system, to be the author of your fate, and accept there are no rules other than ones that you have to live by and you have to manage as best you can with strong cultural friendships, social friendships. All of these we recognise as supports, and our heritage is a support. Our historical heritage can be traumatic and upsetting, but it can also be a great support and a source of nourishment for us. It's heartening, therefore, to see that the college is now tackling racism so actively. This sort of conversation wasn't happening 10 years ago. It was very hard even 5 years ago to have this sort of conversation. So I'm delighted that there are so many actions within the college and so many good colleagues. And I'm delighted I'm not lonely in my challenge of racism and taking an anti-racist stance with a few of us who, it's fair to say, have struggled to get the message across. There are so many good people now involved in both exposing structural racism, racism in practice and in services, and also in society, but doing it in a positive way for societal good, for greater benefits to all. What opportunities there are for the profession, for psychiatrists, if South Asian wisdom and knowledge can be incorporated into college practices and processes, particularly adopting that we self approach, that we're all in it together, but we really are, and we exist in that space, that we're not operating for ourselves and our own achievements, which can be challenging at times. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I know that was a bit of a gallop through my cultural biography, but I'm very happy to take questions.
Cam, thank you. Thank you very much, Cam. That was really very interesting insight. And I think you really highlighted the we self versus I self, and I hope that there'll be some discussion on it in the Q&A. I can already see that there have been some questions to you about some of the issues, and so I think I'm sure we'll pick them up as we go along. But now it's my pleasure to invite the next speaker, whom I've known very well, I have to say, for quite some time, I think over 3 decades now, and that's Dr. Anantha Dave, and I'm privileged and honored to be her husband, but I invite her today in the capacity of being a medical director at the Lincolnshire Partnership Trust, and also, as most of you may know, that she was the chair of the BAME task force of the college. And her report has been published and has been very influential, and has actually led to, I think, hundreds of us, if not thousands, have had structured risk assessments at work, and I'm sure possibly saved lives, Anantha. So it's my pleasure to welcome you and to listen to your thoughts. Welcome.
Thank you, Subodh, and hello everyone, good afternoon. And thank you to the Royal College of Psychiatrists for giving me this opportunity to be a part of the first South Asian History Month. What I'm going to say are largely personal reflections about my life here in this country as a proud British Asian, British Indian specifically, as well as a South Asian. But intertwined with my professional insights, because I think the two are closely linked. And as I go through my reflections on what it has meant for me to be a British Asian in this country and look at the highs and lows of it, really, if you like, I hope that at the same time that will give you some insights into how we can make sense of all the things that have happened due to COVID, and more importantly, move on from there. So what I would like to say is that my identity, although it is British Indian, it is actually made up of several component parts. So just to briefly tell you about my cultural background, I'm from India. I was born in the southern part of India in a state which was then called Andhra Pradesh, in a town called Rajahmundry, and my parents were both from there. My father migrated to what is now Mumbai, but was then Bombay. And for him, the magnitude of that migration was as big, you know, coming from a small village near Rajahmundry to a big city like Mumbai, and all that it entailed, and the separation from his family, and the huge effort and cost and time involved in traveling to and fro. The impact of it was as large as me migrating several years later from India to the UK. And, you know, I'd taken my first flight then when I flew from Mumbai to land in the UK. So migration is not new to my family, although I'm a first generation migrant to the UK. So as part of my Indian heritage, I was born in South India. I moved to Mumbai, and I spoke Telugu for the first 5 years of my life. That was the only language I spoke. It was the language of my parents, and I was looked after by my mum at home, who was a homemaker. And I went to school at the age of 5 and was exposed to Hindi and English for the first time. And the language of the city that I grew up in, Mumbai, is Marathi. It belongs to the state of Maharashtra. So I learned to speak English with a Marathi twist over the years. And I think people who hail from India and from, you know, the Indian subcontinent might recognize this strange intermingling of Hindi and English, which has quite, you know, acquired a flavor and distinction of its own. So then I learned Marathi, and then of course I married Subodh, who has got origins in west of India in Gujarat, and in central India, that is Madhya Pradesh. So I've been exposed to Gujarati and Malvi. So I count myself as very fortunate to have this rich, diverse cultural heritage even before I came to the UK. And of course, when I came to the UK, I have now been in this country for 25 years this year, and I'm a proud British Asian. And that intermingling, the dualism of Britishness and Asianness has, I think, been for me, a very constructive and helpful blending. And I think the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And for me, the dualism, the intertwining, the gestalt nature of it is really important in keeping in mind how we deal with the problem of racism and race equality and anti-racism, creating anti-racism, but also valuing people in their entirety for what they are. So I think when I came to this country, I wasn't as confident as I am today. I think coming here actually helped me unleash some of my potential, develop confidence, and I think as a woman in India, being part of a culture or celebrating a culture does not mean we shy away from confronting some of its less desirable qualities. So honesty is a form of kindness, Brené Brown says, and being part of a culture also means that while we rejoice in its glorious richness, we have to confront its unpleasant aspects squarely. So the gender discrimination, the casteism, the obsession with fairer skin that's prevalent in India actually can hold back quite a few people, held me back for quite some time for various reasons. After coming to this country, I am very grateful that due to the presence of several mentors and well-wishers, I got opportunities which I would not have got otherwise. So I'm grateful to the people who have helped me in this country. I'm grateful to the UK for giving me a home, and I'm grateful to the complementing of the British and Asian cultures that makes me who I am. Having a supportive partner also made me dream bigger than what I would have dreamt maybe, and made me realize I could spread my wings. However, again, coming to the UK, I would say I faced welcome and vitriol in equal measure. While I have had appalling instances of racism and discrimination at work and in the community over my 25 years, it has also been tempered by amazing acts of kindness and being supported and mentored, and the value of mentoring really useful. So the trauma that we face, though, has always got cumulative intergenerational effects. And that's what we are seeing in COVID today. So when I look at how the effects of the racism in British society have affected me, what is happening today triggers the memories of what has happened in the past. So for us as a country, whether it's Grenfell, whether it's Windrush, or whether it is unfortunately the increase in racism and discriminatory attitudes that I have seen over the last years in the wake of the Brexit discussions and our Brexit decision, that is the stain and the blot on British history. But we are here today with a chance to right the wrongs, because if we are honest about looking at our past, both the South Asian bit and the British bit, there is an opportunity to set things right. And it's really important that we are able to look at things in the whole. And the collective looking back and looking forward is important, and facing things as they are. And the death, the destruction, the grief, the loss that has been brought about by COVID is because collectively we treated people unequally. The injustice that is COVID has been in a long line of injustices that we have suffered. And the death of any person should not go in vain. John Donne said, "Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind." So if we are truly to move forward with looking at what's happened due to COVID, I think there are several things that we need to keep in mind. And my time as chair of the Task and Finish group, which I've now handed over because the presidential leads for race equality have been appointed, but that allowed me to listen to stories and look at examples, good and bad, during the times of COVID from across mental health services in the country. And I worked as part of a fantastic team. And it was almost a compression of the microcosm of the joys and the sorrows and the sadness of life. The joys because I saw people stepping up and supporting each other. Sorrows because inequality and inequity made people lose their lives. But this microcosm, this intense compression of life into the last 3 months has given me some insights. And this is in my role as a doctor, manager, Task and Finish chair group, parent, citizen, and community person over the years, all of them blended together. And the first thing, so looking back, that's what we've done. Looking forward, what I would say is, if we are to provide hope and healing and move forward from not only COVID, but any future challenges or injustices, firstly, give voice or give some space to the trauma. Give it a name, identify it, and give room for it to heal. It needs a voice. It needs love to heal. And we have to understand that it is cumulative and intergenerational. And attending to it is really important. It is said that attention is one of the greatest forms of love. So if you want to understand the trauma, grief, loss, make sure that you're giving enough space, resources, and value to hearing that trauma and those stories and helping people heal. So remember that we are trying to practice humanism as the greatest equality of all, and don't dehumanize people, don't depersonalize, identify by their correct names, identify and record their ethnicity correctly, and make each death count. Let it not be in vain. And I'll give you an example of what it means to dehumanize, be dehumanized, or be counted as just part of a multitude without that individual voice. It has happened sometime during my career that somebody was trying to call me by my correct name. It proved difficult for them to say Anantha. I tried several times to write my name, to hold a label against my chest for my name to be read, to spell my name phonetically. And in the end, that person said, "I'll call you Nadia instead. It's an equally beautiful name." And that is the extent of, I didn't speak up against it then. Today I would. So it's given me that confidence. But you've got to call people correctly. You've got to identify their ethnicity correctly, their identity correctly. And you've got to call out things by their correct names. So naming it correctly is really important. Giving voice to that trauma is important. Paying attention actively, looking beyond the veil, beyond the color of the skin. The color of the skin is my sin, one of the American TV commentators said. Let that not be the case. Let that not be blinding us to other things about that person. Look underneath the skin. Look behind the veil. Remember, people are greater than the sum of their parts, and it's very you're not going to help them or heal them or do right by them by compartmentalizing them or categorizing them. The second thing I would say is what the leaders we develop or we have today are the ones whom we have helped develop over the years. So if you want the right leaders for tomorrow, and if you want the leaders of tomorrow, today, to stand up and be equitable and fair, we've got to develop them correctly. We've got to do the right teaching, training, whether it is equality and diversity training, whether it is the curriculum, we've got to make it work and make it fit for purpose. And then we'll have not the snowy white peaks of leaders, but jewel bright peaks, I would say, of having a diverse leadership across. So teaching the next generation is important. And the other thing I would say as an immigrant is understanding the immigrant narrative is important. Now, within the BAME group, we've got many people who are first generation immigrants. So having that access or having the experience of having migrated and all the stresses and joys and the opportunities, but the difficulties it brings is really important to understand. Now, migration is not one of the protected characteristics. It's not under the Equality Act, but I would contend that it counts equally when you're looking at all the characteristics of a person, the gender, the sexual orientation, the religion, etc. So really understanding the migrant narrative is important. And secondly, recording history. Lastly, one of the last points is recording history correctly. There's a very great poet, there was a great poet in India called Mahashweta Devi, a very powerful and articulate female. And she said, history is power. What kind of history do we want to bequeath to the next generation? And then she says, I had such a great asthirata, is a kind of restlessness, asthirata in me. Such an udbeg, a Bengali and Hindi word, that I had to write. And I say to myself, I have that restlessness to speak. I have to speak so that I can face myself without a sense of guilt, and I can pass on hope and honesty to the next generation. So let us not be confined in our possibilities. Let us soar beyond what has happened. Let us try and find the wings of hope that can take us to a really equitable society and help us think outside the box. I'll end with the lines of Rabindranath Tagore. Again, a very great poet of India, wrote in Bengali mainly, several of his works translated into English, and he was the first Asian Indian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And one of the poems of his is Where the Mind is Without Fear, and just a stanza that I would like to leave you all with. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the mind is led forward by thee, and it could be anyone, it's not necessarily religious, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. So let us stand up and be counted as those who not only identify the problems, but are part of the solution. And let us go forward into ever-widening circles of meaningful action. Thank you.
Thank you, Anantha. That was really powerful stuff. And ending on that, on those poems, really, really like that. I think the comments are very, very positive. Of course, I think I really like the way you articulated the need for a psychological space and to call it out for what it is. And I think that has been my experience. Just before this, I was handing over to the new Associate Dean of Trainee Support Committee. And I think we're talking about the conferences and why they've been so successful. And I think the feedback suggests that people have really valued the fact that they could come into the physical space of the college and actually have a space, both a physical and psychological space, where they could share their views openly. And I think, as all of you have said, I think this is a very good progressive step from the college that we have taken the lead in tackling this. I think it's important that we are able to mainstream these issues and not keep them to the margins as they have, and they still continue to reside in some parts of our medical world, let alone the wider society. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to invite my friend Shahid Latif, who's the chair of the Transcultural Psychiatry Specialist Interest Group and a very sharp mind. And some of you may have seen him last week. And I really look forward to your views, Shahid. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Subodh, for that very generous introduction. And, fantastic input from Professor Bhuvi and from Anantha. and how names are really, really important. I mean, my name is Shahid. I'm mostly called Shaheed. And I say to them, Shaheed means a martyr, while Shahid means a witness. So people still find it difficult to call me Shahid sometimes, or Shahid, as we don't do it as a D. So I said, don't say David, say David. It's similar. So rather than saying David, rather than not saying David, don't say Shaheed, say David or Shahid. So, you know, these are some of the things we have to be very clear into how names are important. And Anantha has touched on that, and it's also powerful, and the impact for many people that names can have, because names are very important. This is the second edition of the South Asian History month that we're celebrating. And it's really thankful to the Royal College for setting this up, and the first college to do so. And like we said last week, this is not something that has been plucked out or thought about just in the last 3 months since the COVID situation or the Floyd George situation. This was from last year, so it's been thought about, very well thought about as going forward. But one thing I would like to say about the South Asian History Month is that we as South Asians should not confine ourselves to be talking just in the month of South Asian history. This should be actually a springboard. And this is what we should be using it as. This should be the start, an opportunity to talk about the difficulties, the challenges, and the successes as well. Because South Asians are, in the NHS, we all know, 10,000 doctors, 50, 60 years ago coming to the call right at the inception of the NHS, and how the contribution in keeping one of the best or the largest services in the world, industries in the world going. And we should be proud as South Asians that we have been part and parcel of it from almost day one. And not only been part and parcel of it, we've kept the oil in the engine running, and we continue to do so. So it's something really, really to be proud of and celebrate. Having said that, there are certain elements within there where individuals already last week and today have touched on the difficulties and the struggles and the challenges that have been, that people have befallen before individuals. And, we have now the opportunity to talk about them. We were embarrassed. We did accept it. We were in denial, but you know what? It's time to move on. And while we are talking about the celebrations, we have to talk about the difficulties that we have experienced. Many of us who are psychiatrists or work in mental health, when we do talk to our patients, we do talk about the importance of being able to speak about the difficulties or the past, etc. We are human beings, we are dictated by emotions, and we will also be impacted by any negativity, be it due to the color, due to culture, due to ethnicity, etc. And this is, again, going forward, we must start talking about it. It's time for a change. We've already touched on issues in relation to first or second generation. I was born in the UK. I went back to Pakistan, one of the best educations I had, because it offered me a good opportunity to understand both cultures. And when someone asks me, where do you belong to? I say to them, I'm a champion of both cultures. And this is what it offers. I would say the same for the next generation, for the second generation, whether, it's our children or whether many of us who immigrated 15, 20, 30 years ago, and our second or third generation Asians coming through, South Asians who are part and parcel of society here, and may have some levels of confusion or questions in their mind as to where we belong. And I would say to them, and I would encourage all of you to say to them, that what they can offer is much, much more. And that is, again, being champions of both cultures. And we should encourage them to understand the South Asian culture much better, as we do, many of us who have migrated or have boomeranged like myself between two cultures over the years. Again, some of the things that we need to talk about is how we value and support South Asians, and how we go forward in making sure that not only we learn from the COVID-19 situation and all the lives lost that Anantha has touched on, and the work that has been done in relation from the task force, and how we springboard from there going forward. Also from the George Floyd, these are part of the bigger BAME non-white cultures that we do talk about, and how we utilize those and use them again to learn and go forward and be able to talk about them honestly. Some of the things which which I think is really, really important. And sometimes we always talk about is cultural competencies. I mean, we're all different culturally, though we are all from South Asia. You know, we're not a homogenous background. We are all different within ourselves, but the commonality is being from South Asia. So there is a commonality within the culture, but there are cultures within cultures. So when we talk about cultural competence, does it fit all? No, it doesn't. One size doesn't fit all. It's different strokes for different folks. And that's what we really need to be conscious of. What we really need to be thinking about is cultural intelligence, and how rather than trying to understand one's culture, which one should, it's also trying to get involved with one's culture. There are always a lot of questions around how do I understand and how do I know whether I'm doing things differently, or whether I'm doing things right, or whether there is any element of unconscious bias. I would say two things. Number one, the first thing always is be conscious, be self-aware of your own thoughts and in situations. Because when we become self-aware, like we tell many of our patients or service users, when we talk about the process of mindfulness, we always talk about the here and now and what our feelings are like. And it's very similar for us and the indigenous population to be aware of unconscious process biases. And that's where we talk about things like self-awareness and our own attitudes towards things. We have to question ourselves. When we do have certain attitudes, we have to take a step back. And this is where this whole issue about white privileged allies, etc., comes in. And we have to work together. We can't do this by ourselves. Having champions is really, really important. Most of you must have read Paul Rees's blog a couple of weeks ago, and other blogs which came to the fore. It's really, really important that we do start talking and personalizing our stories and bringing it to real life. If we don't do that, it would all remain where it is, because until we don't talk about our personal stories, we won't be able to go to the next step. And I think we are now starting to do that, and that's absolutely fantastic. But there's still a lot of things to discuss, and our life stories, which have been discussed last week and today by Professor Bhuvi and also by Anantha, some of the life stories, these are really powerful. And I think we need to continue to do this, not just at the Royal College level, but also at the individual trust level. I'm aware of some of the trusts looking at the college are now talking about having their own South Asian History Month, and that's absolutely fantastic. Again, and these are opportunities where we do springboard, and I use that word again and again, that we must not let this go. And it's not just about the month of July, it's going forward for the rest of the 12 months where we continue with this process. What some of the important things I suppose I would like to touch on in order for South Asians, where I would feel, and some of the discussions I've had with the others, how they can feel supported and more involved. Some of the things include things like being part of the solution, especially in issues related to discrimination, racism, etc. So rather than being some work being done somewhere else, I think we need to be part and parcel of that. It's really, really important that we get ourselves involved and make sure that we get ourselves involved. If we're not involved and part of that, we will have the same feeling that things are being done to us rather than having the ownership of being part and parcel of situations. I mean, some of the things I can, some that have been done recently, which again has been part of the COVID-19 BAME task force by the Royal College chaired by Anantha, was some of the risk assessments. I can tell for a fact that we've done a feedback mechanism post-risk assessment, and it's been quite positive because we've actually personalized them to all. It's a one-to-one. It's not a tick box exercise where an individual becomes a data or a figure or a number. It's individualized one-to-one. And that's what makes a real difference. It's understanding individuals, not only the age or what sex they are, but also their cultural and ethnicity and what challenges and what they feel and what they fear and whether there's any griefs processes going on, and how we support individuals through that process. As part of the South Asian immigration we're talking about, even now, we still have a lot of South Asians coming through to work in the United Kingdom, and some of them talk about certain elements. Some of them are picked up in the Fair to Refer by Roger Klein. But when you talk to individuals, these are real life events where people do talk about loneliness, they do talk about isolation, they do talk about not being involved, not being provided with what many others would in relation to their training, in relation to their education, in relation to exams, etc. So it's really important going forward that we do start involving and start looking at some of these things as far as academia and exams are concerned. We need to move away from the blame culture. This is something else from a GMC perspective that we have discussed, moving away from the blame to the learning culture and involving the individuals, that this is something that we need to learn from as opposed to being blamed for something, because blame only offers negativity and it only pushes individuals away, and it doesn't offer anything else. So a learning culture, developing a learning culture is so, so important. The other thing, I suppose, or the last thing I would like to touch on is issues related to leadership. There's a lot of work to be done, and leadership in different organizations, the Royal College, trusts, NHS trusts, private organizations, how we get individuals from different communities, different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds, how do we get them involved in the leadership process? And I'm talking about leadership at senior level. Number one, not only the accessibility, but also offering the opportunity, the mentoring, individuals coming forward and being asked. Now, obviously within that, some of the things that we need to look at is we have to look at what individual skills are. But I know for a fact, having lived in both cultures, that South Asians are very skilled. They have a lot of talents and we have a lot to offer. And this is something that we've proven already over decades, and we continue to prove. And I'm sure that going forward, we have a lot of contribution still to offer. Thank you very much.
Hi, Shahid, thank you very much. That was really a very enlightening talk. I think your concept of cultural intelligence really stood out for me. And having done equality and diversity training in various, at various times for various roles, I really feel that our modern offer for that training needs to incorporate some of the elements that you've talked about. And I hope that that's certainly something that we will look at. But you talked about contributions. I remember discussing Jugaad, which is, a lot of the people from South Asia will be familiar with that concept, which is of quick, fast innovations. And I really do feel that that is something that NHS needs to adopt as a whole. And one of the outcomes, positive outcomes, silver lining, if you can call it, of the COVID crisis has been that there has been a lot of Jugaad in the NHS. We've really seen digital innovations take off. We've all fast forwarded certain innovations which would have taken decades. So I feel this is the right time to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Raj Rajesh Mohan, who's been the chair of the rehab faculty, but also is the new presidential lead on race equality. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Raj. And I think you're going to tell us a little bit about future challenges, but I hope that you will touch upon some of the solutions that you plan to introduce as in your new role as well. So over to you, Raj. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Subodh. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be part of this event. And I'm so delighted about July. Is such a great month because it's for the first time that we are having a South Asian History Month at the college. And also we have a new president who immediately announced that his focus was going to be on equality, addressing racism, and no longer be silent and quiet about things and injustices that are happening in mental health and in the wider society. So it's incredibly good. We have a virus going around. We have a pandemic beating the nation. We don't know where we're going with that. We also have Brexit looming, but there are good things to think and talk about. I suppose what I wanted to say is that in terms of my own cultural identity, I was born in south of India and I lived there till in my first, second and third decades of life, completed my training in psychiatry in the south, lived in different areas. I picked up a couple of different languages, so not many of my colleagues know what my mother tongue is, for example, and it never occurs to them to ask me what my mother tongue is. They all think that I speak Indian, and that's a language that you may have heard or be accused of speaking. So it's Malayalam, and I also learned to speak a little bit of Tamil and Kannada and a little bit of Hindi. So it was towards the end of my 20s that I left and came to the UK. And it has been a very interesting experience, very interesting journey. What the other privilege I had was I started my entire psychiatric training from scratch and did 5.5 years of training before I got my membership. So I had 11 years of continuous postgrad training. So I'm extremely well trained. So I'm quite privileged by that. But today, the theme of the webinar, the session today is current and future challenges. I don't really like to use the word challenges when you're celebrating the South Asian History Month. And also, what is this challenge? Because it's always been there, hasn't it? Do we need to keep talking about challenges, or do we need to talk about what we might be doing? Or should we just take a pause and think of all the things we've achieved, how far we've come, and our own value? We can also get angry in the meantime. So I suppose the biggest thing to celebrate is the proportion of South Asian psychiatrists within the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I think it's about a third, about 30%. And it's this incredibly large number. And they're at every rung of the profession, from students, trainees, junior doctors, SAS doctors, consultants. However, at very senior leadership positions, there is still a little bit of a disparity. There aren't that many at that level. So the other thing is, it also hides something. The proportion of people in the profession hides a bit of truth about the experience of some of those people throughout their careers. So I want to say that many have been subject to racism, racist bullying, discrimination, harassment, gaslighting, you name it, it's happened to them. And they're still there. And they have persevered, they have performed, they have excelled, and they've continued to work. And very often, many of them haven't raised issues and they haven't been investigated, the complaints that they've raised. So I guess it's a very complex picture. The contributions are immense. The suffering is also very significant. So without kind of talking about challenges, I'm just going to think about alternative scenarios. Our society is changing. It's changing rapidly. If you look at the whole population, many people don't see medicine as a type of career that they would want to do. And you know that South Asians value medicine quite highly. The representation of South Asians in medicine, will it decline? I suspect not, because there will be a reduction in other groups of people wanting to do medicine. The prestige of medicine in South Asian minds will continue, and relatively the proportion will stay the same or even increase. So that's something to look forward to. So the other bit is that we are going to experience shortfalls in numbers going forward. This would be because of a number of reasons. We already have shortfalls. Where are they going to bring doctors from? It's very likely to be South Asian countries. It's likely to from countries outside the EU. So this is another reason why we would assume that this population will increase. So we need to look out for the well-being of the group of South Asian doctors as a whole. But I also want to think it is about the well-being of the group of doctors and in their entirety. That's where the concept of equality comes in. So I've started to think about what the future might look like, to try and visualize what it might be. So if you're a South Asian medical student, you go into medical school, and your experience of education, your experience of learning, your experience of interaction should be at par with anyone else. You should not be subject to bullying. You should not be subject to differential experience. You should not have poorer outcomes in terms of your examination. So you would also want to see more people from deprived backgrounds, or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds coming into medicine. You shouldn't come into medicine just because you could afford, or your families were doctors, for example. So you want to see a reduction or elimination of experiences of racism, discrimination, microaggressions, and for students to be valued for what they bring in. And that includes the cultural richness that they bring, irrespective of which culture, which background they come from. And then you qualify, you go through your training, you become consultants. You want to be looking at the first opportunity to get a CEO. Your medical director contacts you and say, it's time for a CEO. Have you put in an application yet? Most of my colleagues who I know from South Asian backgrounds haven't had a CEO until much later. And this is not true of my white colleagues. You also want to see when somebody has done 2 years of the consultant job, your medical director or medical lead comes to you and says, I think it's time for you to take on an associate medical director role, or at least kind of get into that process. I would like to see that happen. When you apply for senior leadership roles, I want your application to be considered exactly the same, to actually stand an equal chance of getting the job. because I distinctly remember when I came here, some of my friends at the time told me, "You've got to be careful, Raj." Actually, I used to be called Rajesh at the time. They won't give jobs to brown people. So I would assume that the total number of complaints and investigations against doctors will come down. And amongst that, the numbers of complaints about South Asian doctors or ethnic minority doctors would be exactly the same as the number of complaints about white people. Same number of people will be referred, or proportion of people will be referred to GMC, because there would not be an ethnic difference. And all investigations will come out with appropriate outcomes, evidence-backed and transparent. Do you see challenges? Actually, I do, because I can't see what has changed in the system enough for those things to happen, for there to be real equality. So I'm expecting that, this is not going to finish here. We just need to continue to push forward. We need to ask for more transparency. We need to ask for equality. We need to ask for change. To achieve any of this, South Asian doctors have duties as well. Just because you come from an ethnic minority group doesn't make you an expert in culture or doesn't make you culturally sensitive automatically. It is still part of learning. You need to learn to work with people from every different culture. You need to learn every day of your working life. But you also need to push forward for change to happen in your clinical teams by setting good examples, by also making sure that you value every aspect of equality and diversity. This means looking at gender equality, LGBT equality, disability-related things. All of those things should be in the forefront. That way you can advance the concept of equality and make a difference. So the Royal College has made a difference this year by prioritizing race equality and equality in general. So I'm pleased to be one of the leads along with Dr. Lade Smith. I think many of you might know her. She's well known for her work on the Mental Health Act and her work on equality. I have some concerns moving forward, and these concerns would be around what we're up against, because we are facing a period of austerity in future. What generally tends to happen with austerity is that there is going to be a squeeze on the NHS, and that squeeze is going to be acutely felt on clinical services. At the coalface, you have Asian doctors, South Asian doctors, and mainly BAME doctors. We also have a larger number of SAS doctors who will be holding fort in many services, and with reduced resources, pressure is going to go up. If the COVID scare continued, the excess mortality rate may continue to be an issue for people from South Asian backgrounds. So it's something we need to be aware of. But again, I'm just going to wind up soon by saying that the South Asian History Month is July, but it doesn't end with 1 month. It is a process, it's a journey, it's a time to celebrate. But throughout the year, you'll be thinking about contributions of the South Asian group, whether they are UK-born South Asians or immigrant groups. They all have plenty to contribute. And what we need to do is to continue the fight for equality in every single area. Otherwise, this fight will never be won. So I think that's where I'm going to end. I want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak today and being part of such a great panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. That was really excellent, and I think it sets out your manifesto in a way as well. I think very, very important point you made there, and I think the comments were also reflecting that about being consistent in our values, and I think that is very important. And I think you can't be challenging, race inequality and then condoning gender inequality or inequality on the grounds of disability. So I think it's important that there is some synergy in the overall equality movement. And I know that while your portfolio is going to be mainly race equality, I think clearly their intersectionality is quite important. I think Anantha kind of touched upon it as well in her talk, is how people who face multiple challenges and multiple inequalities, technical term being intersectionality, have a bigger mountain to climb. And I think it's important that we deal with that issue as well. So I certainly look forward to your term and your actions. And thank you again very much. And it's time for our next speaker. Our next star speaker is our new registrar. So all of you will be familiar with Trudy Senviratne from SLAM, a star of perinatal psychiatry, and has done some really very impressive work across the country in putting perinatal psychiatry on the map and improving the lives of many of our patients. But now I think, Trudy, even more hopes from you in your role as registrar. So we are all your members. Tell us about your plans on meeting these challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Subodh, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And thank you for everybody who's made the event possible. Actually, I've got a couple of slides, so I think I'm the only person that threw some slides in, but partly to look at the history of the college, because I've been, the title I was asked to speak to was what the college is doing and what will it do, but I also thought actually the history of what the college has done already is tremendously important for us to think about what the next steps are going to be. So perhaps before I put my slides up, a brief note or a short note about my own journey, which is in a blog which appeared this week on the college website. There's a little bit more there. But I am a Sinhalese Sri Lankan, and I arrived here relatively young, at the age of about 8, but did a little bit of boomerang, as Shahid has said, between Sri Lanka and here for a couple of years, really because it was very tough settling down in the East End in London, where my father had come over as a paediatrician and my mother as a paediatric nurse, although she didn't get to do that for a long time because she worked in a handbag factory in the East End. And I guess speaking Sinhalese but not Tamil, and I'd love to be able to speak to Tamil, and that's a big regret, and I keep trying to learn it as I get older. I think that sort of dualism, that bringing together, you know, I feel very Sinhalese, I feel very Sri Lankan, but I also feel extremely British now, having been here, you know, for a very, very long time. My dad didn't want me to become a psychiatrist. I had a bit of a battle with him because he didn't really accept it as a real specialism in medicine at all. He was finally very happy when I did take it up. But I think it still took him a while, though, to accept it was a decent specialism in medicine. I spoke with Professor Shahan Williams, who's the current president of the Sri Lanka College of Psychiatrists, just in an email exchange recently. And I was so thrilled that he talks of, rather like here, I hope now too, and Kate Lovett would say exactly the same, that the brightest are going into psychiatry now, and it's a very highly sought after specialism. I think the fact that I am a South Asian, Sri Lankan, Sinhalese psychiatrist has brought so many wonderful things. So Chani Kumar, as some of you will know, was my mentor in once I came into perinatal psychiatry. He was the reason I came into perinatal psychiatry. And we had some terrific conversations. I only unfortunately got to work with him for just under 4 years before he passed away, but we had some wonderful conversations about the importance of having a transcultural lens on everything we do in psychiatry. So it was part of a fantastic transcultural study on postnatal depression, for example. And the piece of work I've taken on, perhaps since he passed away, was around looking at parenting capacity of people when they have mental illness. And I've seen time and time again over the last 20 odd years how actually, whether it's, you know, particularly from South Asian cultures where I seem to keep getting asked to go and assess families, that the courts and family courts really don't understand you know, the complexity of what's happening within the families, and making recommendations about whether a child can stay with a parent or not, or a mother or not, within that when they have a mental illness, can be very, very complicated. Okay, I'm going to now just share some slides with you, as I want to really take you through. I hope you can see these now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so going forwards, I think it's so important to also look back, as I said, because the college has done a lot. You know, perhaps it was certainly more than many other Royal Colleges, I want to sort of go back, perhaps not completely, but back to Professor Kenneth Rawnsley back in 1987, who set up a group who looked specifically at this, a report called the Psychiatric Practice and Training in Multi-Ethnic Society, which was published in 1990. It was called the Rawnsley Report. This was then taken forward by Professor John Cox, another perinatal psychiatrist, and a group of colleagues, Roland Littlewood, others, many of whom looked at the original report, and then, you know, really looked at issues of equality, race equality, gender, but also the attainments in education and training, thinking about nosological aspects of diagnoses and treatment, thinking about differential presentations of psychiatric symptoms, transcultural psychiatry, the numbers of members we had from ethnic minority backgrounds, different patient needs from ethnic backgrounds, whether they were older adults or people with intellectual disabilities, and issues such as the referral to and use of psychological therapies, depending on the background that people came from. So this was thought about really carefully at that time. Kamlesh Patel, who became Lord Patel, also helped the college really to scrutinize everything the college did by looking at everything through a transcultural lens. And other great heroes like Parimal Moodley, for example, looked at race equality statements and action plans through the late 90s. I guess back in 1993, there was the awful death of Stephen Lawrence, and the subsequent Macpherson report that classified institutional racism was something the college also took up very seriously in examining its own function, its own way of dealing with psychiatrists and the training that we offered. So, you know, when one looks back, a lot has happened. And we had the wonderful Pearl Hettiarachchi, also from Sri Lanka, who spoke last week, who steered a group on ethnic issues around 2001. Professor Dinesh Bugra that we had last week, again, you know, amazing work that he has offered over time, looking at these issues, and Sir Simon Wesley, both as president and then taking forward the Wesley report and the review of the Mental Health Act. I actually came off a call with David Lamioni this morning, where we are still looking at implementing the many recommendations of that review. Really important, and the important need, of course, to sort of look at various recommendations, but particularly around those with protected characteristics. And in Professor Wendy Burns' time, again, you know, lots of work done there. There was a membership survey that was conducted, and the reason given for high rates of detention of BME patients was due to barriers into services, and also discrimination. There was a position statement only in 2018, and again, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, you know, emphasised its commitment to improving both mental health care and respecting values and principles of diversity inclusion, both for staff, but also for our patients. So I think that was the graph that was around the survey that we conducted. I want to just say thank you so much to Anantha today. She hasn't spoken of all the work that she drove towards this, but this was an amazing piece of work to have happened through COVID times, and implementing this has further highlighted the importance of not just for South Asians, I guess, but for all of our BAME population. I also can't see you. Can you see me now?
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I think we're at a fantastic time now, as you know, all the presidents before us, all the work that's happened in the college before us. But moving forward, we have a new president, Adrian James, who's absolutely committed to taking this agenda forward. We have presidential leads, so thank you, Raj, and thank you for laying out your manifesto, which I will absolutely work alongside you with. I think what's quite shocking when we reflect back, although there has been movement, how much movement has there been? How much more can we do? I think that there is still plenty more to do. I think there are issues of training that we can definitely improve on. There are also issues of supporting all our sort of ethnic minority staff, including our South Asian staff, is something that we can definitely do more of. But I hope that with Raj and his commitment, and Laddie also as one of our presidential leads, and all the work that she has done, that we can certainly take this forward. I also want to mention actually the enormous work that previous deans and associate deans and our current dean, Kate Lovett, does. I want to specifically say thank you to Subodh in the talk today, because actually between the dean and the associate dean, Subodh has been the associate dean for training support. He's about to be replaced by Dr. Israel Adibukun, and the associate dean for undergraduate psychiatry was Anya Corzum, and she is about to be replaced by Dr. Charlotte Wilson-Jones. Now, what we've heard today is that actually getting the right people into psychiatry is really important. We are an amazing specialty. I know that given there are so many South Asian psychiatrists going into psychiatry, not just in the UK, but across the world, I know that we have an important job to do in the Royal College of Psychiatrists, enticing the right people to come into psychiatry in the first place, from sixth formers through medical schools and into training itself. We have an enormous job to do reminding people of the importance of both race equality and all the other equality agendas as they become psychiatrists. So the journey, it very much sits as part of that educational process. Professor Mohammed Al-Uzri is our new presidential lead for international affairs, and there is also a very important role that Mohammed will be taking to tackle both race equality and equality at an international level. So just to wrap up then, perhaps it was less so a story about my own journey, but more the ask was about what we're going to be doing as a college. I'm really pleased that both Adrian James and Paul Rees, our chief exec, will be co-chairing our next steps. And this is a very live conversation that we're looking at developing two task forces. So one is looking directly at race equality, and the other one is to look at equality. And the equality one is to very much think of all the other equalities together. You know, it's important that we don't put everything into one place, because we want to give everything as much time as it requires. So hopefully with the support of Laddie and with the support of Raj, we'll be taking this work forwards. I really hope, I'm a very hopeful person, and I don't know whether that comes from my heritage or from me, but I really hope that there will be a quiet tipping point in how we talk about these subjects and how we talk about the importance of psychiatry as we go forwards. And I really hope that you know, these next steps that we're taking and are about to take will produce something very meaningful, so that when we come back to celebrate future South Asian months and years, that we will be able to say, well, look what we achieved in that particular period of time. Now, I know it's a collective effort of so many people to be able to move things, but it feels like there's an opportunity. It feels like there's not just the virus of the COVID, but it feels like a wave of opportunity around these issues as well. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Trudy, and all the panel members. Such an interesting discussion, such a vast topic to cover in just 1.5 hours, really. I think it required probably a day to cover all these different strands of discussions which took place. I started to hear about the college wanting to do something for South Asian History Month about a year back, and ideally it was going to be a month-long celebration which had to be curtailed to just 2 webinars because of COVID-19. I think there's so many. There are about over 3,000 Royal College members from South Asian countries, and there's such a huge diversity within the South Asian diaspora as well. In terms of history, I do agree with Subodh regarding the links between Britain and India go back to the British colonial days. I don't know whether any one of you have read Anarchy by William Dalrymple, really, which actually just is such an eye-opener regarding the imperial rule in India. And the other book, which probably I should have read before I came over to England 24 years back, was Watching the English by Kate Fox, The Hidden Rules of English Behavior. I think we, the first generation immigrants, also have little knowledge about the English norms and hidden rules of English behavior, because in South Asian countries, everything is out. You can ask someone and people will tell, while in England, it is the stiff upper lip. It is difficult to understand, and you learn only by experience. I would just start off by asking all the panel members one broad question, really. See, because I've just looked at the questions which are coming up, and all of you are well-established leaders in mental health services. How have you managed to show this resilience in spite of all the adversities, and you all talked about your own personal experience of racism. Can I start with Professor Bui, please?
Yes, so thank you. Very difficult question, because I think when you're younger and growing up, there's a sort of sense that you don't even see it. You are accommodated to it, you're conditioned to it, and you're not aware of it. And the evidence, the research evidence, is that if you do see it, you have to do something about it. And you only do something about it if you've got a good chance of succeeding. And so psychologically, we're configured to not notice it and to not to do anything about it if it's so difficult. So I think most of the time we do our best, work hard, and continue to do what we think is right and have networks and friendships, and we're brilliant at doing that. But it's only when you get into situations which don't make sense, why things didn't go the way you expected, why clearly things weren't right, and then it becomes a problem. And I think it's in those moments that one starts to question what's going on, and that's where structural factors are more important than interpersonal, because if you can't see it, sometimes you can guarantee the organisation can't see it either. I also think that although we're perceived to be successful and doing brilliant things, there's always a cost. I've talked about this before. When you are managing and coping with so many projections of identity. You know, a name is not right. You have to constantly correct our name. The number of times people put an H in the middle of my name. And the number of times you have to manage sort of minor sort of hassles and adversity and microaggressions. All of that does have a cost. It doesn't matter how successful you are. In fact, in some ways, you're in a worse position when you're successful because you're symbolic of race relations. You're symbolic of the threat to people's perceived identity of some sort of historic continuity between the past and the present and the future for those who, without knowing it, overly worship their nationality and their identity and their histories. So actually, you come under more attack, and I would say there is a cost. So looking after yourself is extremely important. I also think that's a factor in why there aren't more leaders. It's not just about not being selected and giving opportunities. I think people actively make decisions about, do I really want to be in that toxic environment and have to put up with that? And I think that it's both of those things going on all the time. I could go on, but I think others will have other views to give as well.
Thanks, Professor Bui. Anantha, do you want to respond to that? And then Subodh, probably. Yeah.
I think what has kept me going was the question, I think, isn't it? What is it that has helped me get to this position? For me personally, I think having a supportive mentor, even when you're facing a lot of adversity, discrimination, etc., that one supportive person, the one person in your life who values you for who you are and encourages you, and sees the potential in you. So it's a combination of mentoring and sponsoring, I think, which is really important. I think that's made a big difference to me at every stage of my career. And I think, you know, when something goes wrong, I believe it can either make you or break you. So at times I was very disheartened and demoralized, but there were times when I felt strongly enough that I wanted to stand up to the injustice or the inequality. And it was incremental steps. It doesn't come easily. And, you know, as Cam was saying, it does come at great personal cost. So there have been times when I've stepped back and then come back again. And I think you've got to constantly keep pausing and reflecting and decide whether this is the correct way for you and what is the best way in which you can make a difference. So that's what's helped.
Thanks, Anantha. Subodh, you probably have a different insight because you've talked about the historical aspects as well, isn't it? And a lot of the racism can be subconscious or rather than overt. So how have you managed to be so resilient and be in a position as you are now within psychiatry in UK?
So thanks, Santosh. I agree with Cam. I think it's not easy, and I think, you know, I think obviously things like mentors and sponsors really are very helpful. I think support from your family, having something else outside psychiatry is helpful. I've been blessed. My colleagues, a lot of them are here today, and they've been supportive in the chat. So you can see that those kind of things really make a difference. But I think at the end of the day, I think there is something which is a little bit abstract, but I think there's something about a consonance between your values and your actions. And I think ultimately all of what we do has to have some personal meaning to us, you know. And I think that what is really heartening about our bunch of psychiatrists, and I think in a way we are blessed to be in this profession. And there was some question here as well, someone asking, why aren't we called Asian British, or why do we say British Asian? And I think those kind of things always will come up. But a fundamental part of our identity is also being psychiatrists. And I think that for me, that identity is quite important. And I think that is, in a way, I wouldn't say it necessarily supersedes other identities, but it's a very, very important part of my own personal identity. And I know that that's the identity I share with a lot of other people in this country. And that is where the collegiate element of the college comes in. That is where my camaraderie with my colleagues comes in. And I think that's a really powerful force, you know. So I think, Anantha, you made this point before. And I think, you know, we as psychiatrists do this all the time, right? I mean, we sit with people who are sometimes extremely unwell and are disagreeing with us on pretty much everything we say to them. And yet we are able to find that common purpose that allows that collaborative working to happen. We do this day in and day out. That's part of our DNA. And so this shouldn't be that difficult for us, I mean, this is essentially in group and out group, right? And that's what it is about, right? So it's about finding that common purpose. And I really feel that the more we are able to find common purpose with a wider group of people, the more we'll be able to kind of, feel resilient, the more we'll to succeed in all the objectives that we set. So I think, of course, there will be differences, but let's focus on the common purpose. I think that is what will drive us forward. Thank you.
Okay. Any of the speakers want to respond to that? Because I don't want to impose this question to everyone. It is just, I thought it would be a good starting point, because we all have to look at, we look at role models, and we've all encountered racism. I can give a few examples myself, but we need to have we become more rounded with that experience, has those adversities, we have used them in a positive way, isn't it? Because sometimes all these adversities can help you in becoming stronger person. It is quite different when these things are happening to you, but I think if you commit at the other end of the tunnel, they can make you stronger. Trudy, do you want to comment on that? Or?
I can go on for a long time, but we only have so much time. Do you know, probably the two most significant experiences of racism, if you like, I've had as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, was one at the time of the Stephen Lawrence death, actually. So it was, that's partly why I put it up there today. But I don't know if those are people who are around. Many of you were. There were riots in London, and I was an A&E officer, and lots of people were being taken to hospitals away from where the riots were happening. Happened to be the only Asian doctor suturing there, and a lot of very drunken people turning up who were protesting vociferously, and a drunken man, realizing that I was Asian, punched me, and I actually had a suture, needed to be sutured myself. It was such a shocking experience. He called me a Paki. He said, I'm not going to be, excuse my French, but excuse my language, but he wasn't going to be sutured by an effing Paki, as he said. And but I nevertheless, because I was the only person who was bleeding for a lot, continued to suture him because he needed treatment. So I mean, that has always sat with me. The other time was as a psychiatrist working in the East End, where a very large chap who grabbed me because he again developed delusions around Asian women, and tried to sort of attack me as a result. So we grow these things, and I have witnessed, like all of us, we've witnessed various aspects of both institutional racism, towards others, if not towards ourselves. And I think, one of my lessons now, as I've matured, is to call it out, to stick your neck out, to speak, to say things in a helpful way. We see terrible tragedies happening, and people become activists, or really, can go out and riot and do these sorts of, complaining and protesting. But that only goes so far. There's always a wave after these sorts of incidents of activity, and the world wanting it to be different. There's a desperate need for things to move forwards. But I feel like, I really feel like the time has come that, there have been waves and waves, for example, over the last 30 years, that, perhaps this is an opportunity for a tipping point where we can really think about this differently, certainly as psychiatrists and within the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Thanks. So, just moving on to the next theme of questions, and that was more about mainstreaming and how we work together. And I think history has shown that, because we're such a huge geographical region, diverse population, just in India alone, there are about 15 commonly spoken languages and 150 dialects. We have to work together, because see, together we as South Asian diaspora group are stronger. And history tells us again and again, really, that see, if we are not together, then others take advantage of the situation. How are we now, where we are now? How are we going to integrate? And how are we going to, because we've started to talk about racism openly, which is a huge step within the college framework to start talk about racism. So how are we going to get other like-minded people who are interested to take this forward? Raj and Shahid, I have to spell it correctly this time. And I'm also going to ask you about the cultural intelligence, which you mentioned, Shahid. So Raj, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot to discuss today about how we can take things forward. I think there are various different levels to this. People who experience racist abuse or racist harassment or racist crimes, I call it, need to deal with it on an individual basis. We cannot collectively say that somebody's trauma is part of the collective response. They do need to deal with that. Our systems need to have a responsibility to deal with hate crimes of any sort. I think racist hate crimes form 80% of all reported hate crimes in the country, but there are many things that are not reported. So I think that should be very clear. We do need to fortify and improve our legal systems so that justice is done, that people actually will report and something will be done. And I think many of us don't report because we don't think anything will be done. That's something very important. And what I think is more difficult to deal with is structural or institutional type of racism. It's so deeply ingrained in the system that it's so difficult to change any aspect of it. So a person of any ethnicity working in a racist organization is de facto being part of that structural racist system. It doesn't matter how much you protest, your actions will be done as part of an institutional program, how you admit people, how you treat the differential outcomes of people. If 5 times more Black women die in childbirth, all the people working in obstetrics and maternity services, are they all racist? So there are serious issues there. So what I think we need to look at is the programs and approaches that we can take to change organizations from within. And as Trudy said earlier, we have to call it out. We have to create systems where justice is provided. I think that's the way I look at it. Individually, we have to accept that a person has been a victim of crime. They have to get justice and mitigation, and that justice has to be visible.
Thanks, Raj. Shahid, you made some really interesting points. I liked your terminology of cultural intelligence, and I think there were some questions on that. Do you want to expand? You also mentioned about having South Asian History Month in the trust, and that I thought was an amazing idea which could be implemented locally. Over to you, your comments on.
Yeah, just to start backwards, let's start on the South Asian History Month. Absolutely. I mean, and I think as individuals, we need to be talking. I did for a start. Talked to the chief executive, and she was right on it. And as things stand, that we are now going to be celebrating South Asian History Month in the next couple of weeks, which is absolutely fantastic because we have a shared chief executive between Northamptonshire and Leicester. So both of the trust, LPT and NHFD, are both going to be doing it in collaboration, which we're really, really looking forward to. So you see, what happens is one thing leads to another. And I think we need to disseminate this and propagate this around the country. And it's not, shouldn't just, I mean, the South Asian History Month offers a platform and a springboard, but also I think we need to continue whatever is discussed. I think throughout it needs to be or it needs to continue, and this will link in really nice with some of the things that Raj hopefully is going to be talking about in the coming months in his role as a presidential lead. So obviously these things will help. In relation to some of the discussions, I think from working together. I think that's really important, and it's become more and more important even now. We've got these diaspora groups, we've got the British Indian Psychiatric Association, we've got the British Pakistani, the British Sri Lankan, and I think we really need to start doing some work together, not just in conferences from an academic perspective, but also learning perspective, like the discussions we're having right now. So though we are doing this on a college level, I think diasporas play a big role, and I think there's a rich resource there, and I think we need to utilize that. Some of the cultural elements to that, Santosh, I think what we really need to understand, when I came back to the UK about 25 years ago, after spending 12 years in Pakistan, some of the things I picked up earlier on is I didn't realize when I was earlier on in my life, before I left for Pakistan in my teens, and that was how accepted it was, and some of the things that Cam has touched on in the early 70s and 80s, and those programs, it was just accepted. But by the time I came back, it was like coming out of a time capsule and coming back and say, you know what, these things, but people were still not talking about them, but it felt wrong. And starting to train in psychiatry, some of the things that I picked up from some of the South Asian, they were still afraid to talk about certain things, and for genuine reasons. And some of the reasons were, where do I belong? Do I belong back, and should I be talking about my South Asian heritage? Should I be talking about how well belonged and settled I am in the UK? And have I been done a favor? Is this all a big favor for me? Would it be wrong to speak? And these are some of the discussions. And when you talk to people now, they do go back. I think for us, we have a big responsibility. And the responsibility we have is that in our own fields, we've been quite successful. And let's spell that out. And the reason, and why we've been successful, we are still looking to go forward. While we do that, let's not be blinded, or let's not lose focus on the South Asian juniors and trainees that we have. And we need to support them. That's really, really important. We have a role to play at this current time. We've been through it, and now it's our role to actually assist. And when I say I'm not putting them in a bracket and say this is what but we have to be conscious. And these are some of the things that we are discussing in relation to unconscious bias. And that's where things like cultural intelligence really comes in. I just see cultural competence as a tick box exercise. I really don't agree with most of it. It's something that we talk about. Okay, I've done the 3 hours of module of the cultural competence. Am I supposed to now know everything about another person's culture, and are my attitudes change? Am I now more aware? If you are, fantastic. But cultural intelligence is an ongoing process. There's something which everybody has. We have a core and a flex. A core is our deeply rooted attitudes that we have. Our flex are how much are we able to change within that core. And individuals can still maintain the core of their attitudes and beliefs. However, the more flex they have in their personalities and their attitudes, the better and more successful they would be. So that's how I see cultural intelligence.
Thanks. And then we can be advocates of all the cultural diversity. And there's also art, music, films, and Professor Bui mentioned that in his talk. And I think those can be used as part of resilience, mental well-being, because the region has such rich culture. There's so many different types of music, art. Professor Bui, do you want to
sure.
about that? Yeah.
So, I mean, it's such a good seminar. In all you brilliant people. I mean, it's so good hearing this, and it bodes well for the future. I just want to make a couple of quick points about something that perhaps was missed about our shared history. We've all seen extreme poverty and adversity. If you're from South Asia, you've got a South Asian heritage. You've seen how bad it can be. Even now in places, you've seen extreme. So I think that changes the way we see the world. Secondly, because of the multiplicity of identities, we are polytheistic and poly everything, a way of dealing with. We can perspective take in a different sort of way. So I think what the arts and offer is firstly nourishment, that it's a heritage, it's a positive heritage, something to be proud of. Secondly, a form of communication which cuts through the verbal, and the emotional is much more primitive, and we can pick up on that. So I use art all the time in educational processes. But thirdly, also when you're having difficult conversations, sometimes we're doing this in a program at the moment dealing with ethnic inequalities and severe mental health, and communicate messages to commissioners and policymakers and colleagues and peers through art in a way that they hear differently from if you were to say it to them, particularly if it's coming from a service user in some form of narrative. So I think art can be very, very powerful, and South Asia is rich in that tradition, really, and it's neglected to some extent. I also think that I agree with a lot of what's been said about, cultural competence is not a 3-hour training or a 1 hour. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of seeing the world. It's changing the way you operate. I think of Sivanandam, who said, don't ask me to give you racial awareness training. Please don't ask me to do that. Prosecute, set standards, legislate, do something practical. So I think we need to think that racial awareness training, educational interventions on their own don't work. We can persuade people, we can take them to places and make them think differently. Secondly, I'm not a Kleinian by training, but there is resistance. You will come across absolutely egregious examples of racism still today in our organizations and in our spaces. You hear it along gender lines, you hear it along sexuality, you hear it along race. So we have to always be anticipating how to deal with that when it happens, because it will happen. So the race equality leads, you're going to need a lot of courage and a lot of support to get through what's going to come your way. And I think that resistance is inevitable. It's always been there, and it's anticipating and thinking it through, knowing there is a process with integrity and structure that can be followed. Because when there's not integrity or justice in the system, then it hurts everybody. And I think that's one thing we can do. And again, as we know so much extreme adversity from the mother countries, as it were, we know how important justice and integrity and equality is. And I think that's a strength. And then it's all the positive actions that you're describing, and Shahid and Trudy and Rajat, all the things. That's where we spend a lot of time putting our effort. And that sometimes is great, but sometimes it doesn't tackle all the other stuff that's going on in the background. So I think it's anticipating that. And I'm speaking as someone who, I guess, has been around the block on this a few times and has seen the positivity and the negativity, has been surprised and shocked by, even 10 years ago, Department of Health decided to remove the word racism from its policy documents, supported by colleagues in the college. So that, we are a broad college. There will be different views, and we have to be able to speak to the majority and take people with us and persuade it. And that's where art forms and different ways of communicating the evidence is quite important.
Professor Bui, thanks a lot. Thank you, all the speakers, Dr. Trudy Senivaratne, Dr. Anantha Dave, Dr. Rajesh Mohan, Dr. Shahid Latif, and Subodh for chairing this session. And particular thanks for Paul Rees, the Chief Executive of the college, and Dr. Adrian James, the President, who supported this event, really. And in spite of COVID-19, and there's lots of discussion whether how we're going to have South Asian History Month. And also college staff, Catherine, Emma, and Jessica, for all the hard work behind the scenes. So I will draw this session to a close now. Thanks a lot, everyone. All the attendees, I think we've got several still in, really. So thanks a lot for making this South Asian History Month webinar too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.